Okay, hopefully everyone can see those slides. Hi everyone, it is so lovely to be able to be presenting this work to you today. And I am really excited because I've been working on this work for nearly 18 months now. So it's been a long time in the making, and I'm really excited to kind of share the outputs with you and to hear your thoughts. For those of you who have just arrived, welcome. The session is being recorded, so if you would like to stay off camera, please feel free to do so. If you would like to be on camera, always great to see your faces. So that's basically just the intro and the welcomes. So a little bit about me and who I am. My name is Lisa Tagliamoretti. I'm a digital sociologist at the Ministry of Justice, and I've been working for just over 18 months now on modernising lasting powers of attorney. Before I start, I'm just going to kind of answer a question that I'm sure many of you have in your mind, because it's something that I get asked a lot about my job title, and that is, what is a digital sociologist? Essentially, digital sociologists are interested in new ways of understanding society, and we do that by studying what emerges at the intersection of technology, information, social theory, and social life. Now, you can change the word information for content, or you could change the word information for services, but essentially it's about studying that intersection. I am slightly obsessed with technology-human relationships and how they reshape social norms and social values within society. So I'm always kind of thinking about the work that we do and how technology impacts that societal level, and not necessarily just about the individual. I also, just before I kind of get into the meat of the presentation, I wanted to just say a quick word on terminology. In this presentation, you'll hear me refer to person A as well as a supporter. So in the work that I've been doing, I've identified these two kinds of roles that appear in supported journeys, and that is the person who needs support and the person who is able to provide support. For ease of simplicity for this presentation, I have named the person who needs support as person A, and the person who is able to provide support as the supporter. Now, within your own services, as you learn more about supported journeys, you may identify that person A has a particular name in your journey. So if you're at DWP, perhaps person A is named the claimant, and the supporter could be an appointee. Within our own service at Lasting Powers of Attorney, our person A would be a donor, and their supporter could be possibly the attorney. So that was just a quick heads up on just terminology. So I wanted to kind of start off by talking about how I got into this topic and how I got into this sort of subject matter. And to really kind of explain that, the best place for me to start is to talk a little bit about the LPA process and how somebody comes to make an LPA. For those of you who don't know what lasting powers of attorney are, an LPA is essentially a legal document that allows for a person, which we call the donor, to bestow decision-making powers to one or more people. Those one or more people are called attorneys, and they make this document in the event that potentially in the future they will be unable to independently make decisions, and this is usually due to losing mental capacity. So as you can imagine, like, this type of document is really important. It's also a really powerful document, and it comes with a lot of guidance. However, losing mental capacity, thinking about those later years in our life, is quite an emotional and quite a difficult thing for people to do. In fact, we've spoken to a few researchers who have worked on wills, and they have said to us that very often they have found that it's actually easier for people to think about death than it is for people to think about losing their mental capacity. So you can imagine the kind of sort of like heavy emotional work that's involved, and the sort of procrastination that occurs as a result of that. It's not something that we really want to think about. So often when people are making an LPA, the reason they're making it is because they've been triggered to make it, and this trigger has usually been a diagnosis or a sudden loss of physical function. So it might be a diagnosis around dementia, or it might be a diagnosis where somebody's just had a stroke potentially. And did I mention it's a legal document that's really powerful and really important? So you can imagine, like, just cue all of the jargon, cue all of the emotions at this point. And so this is essentially how supported journeys fit into the LPA process. It's because of its complexity, because of its newness, because of the cognitive load and the overwhelming emotions that get associated with this document and that are present in someone's life when they are actually making an LPA. And it's as a result of this that many people actually go to support to be able to make this document because they want to get it right, but also because they're just in a hugely overwhelming place. Now, support can come in lots of different forms, as we've learned. So support can come in the form of a solicitor or a will writer or an estate planner. For people who don't want to or potentially don't have the funds to be able to buy those professional services, we do see that many people do go to charities that provide the service at a much lower cost, and charities who basically can provide some of that guidance and also provide a form filling service. However, we've also spoken to many donors who actually work with their attorneys and in order to get the form completed, and that kind of family or friend support happens a lot. So as a result, when we start looking at our LPA service, we've realized that an estimated 70 to 75% of all of our journeys are not made independently, but rather they are actually made together with somebody else. The other place where supported journeys fits into the LPA service is because once somebody has an LPA, they need to potentially use it, right? So they might not need to use it immediately, but there is a good chance that they might have to use it in the future. And this is where people are having to then go into banks or go to energy providers or telecom providers or even other government departments, for instance, like DWP, where they have to prove that relationship. So an attorney has to prove that relationship with the donor, say, I have an LPA, I am this person's attorney, I have been bestowed with these decision-making powers, and I would like to start using this LPA. And what we've started to realize is that people have told us how incredibly difficult it can be to actually use their LPA. And they often talk about like a kind of organizational bingo that they have to go through, where they phone the organization and they go through all of these different people until eventually they find somebody who knows something about the document, knows how to get it verified. So there's no real standard third-party process to verify the LPA. So as a result of kind of learning about these supported journeys and how they work in our service, I started to plot them on a spectrum, and I just kind of, sort of unimaginatively have called this the LPA support spectrum. But essentially, you've got friends and family who tend to be the attorneys on the informal side of things. Charities potentially could sit here in the middle, I imagine. And then will writers and estate planners slightly more on the formal side, with solicitors being, the most formal as a regulated group of a regulated industry. I then was really curious about, like, are supported journeys, something that I can find, in other services? And I was actually really surprised to find that I struggled actually to find supported journeys being mapped and built into other services, but I did find some. So, for instance, the Census 2021 had some really interesting guidance around how to fill out the census for somebody who has asked for help. The Blue Badge service has a really brilliant supported journey that's built out where you can apply for a Blue Badge on behalf of somebody else. And then probably slightly more on the kind of formal side of things are within the NHS app, you can now link profiles to your own account. So this is where you add different people's, you can get access to different people's health records, and you can act on their behalf. So you can see here just 2 screen grabs from the NHS app. So why does this matter? Why do supported journeys, and why is my finding of them being quite rare even matter for us? Well, it matters because welcome to life. Supported journeys are an incredibly common pattern that we do not actually map out very well in our services, and they happen all the time. They're happening on the very informal side of things, but they're also happening really a lot on the formal side of things. just to kind of give you an instance using our service as an example of formal relationships within society, there's around 6 million LPAs in society, and that number is only going to increase with the number of people who are set to be able to increase, that are set to get dementia throughout their lifetime. So it's really important, and our services need to be able to really adapt and to make sure that they are robust and flexible enough that they can handle more than one person on the other side of a screen or paper form. And so after talking to lots of people, after talking to lots of charities, after talking to lots of solicitors, I have come to learn that actually supported journeys is not just something that happens on the LPA service. This is probably happening on your service too. And we just happen to be measuring it because a supported journey is actually our normal journey, as I showed you earlier with those stats. However, supported journeys matter for other reasons too. They matter because of digital rights, and because supported journeys actually help to actualize a lot of the digital rights that we have. And this is obviously particularly in the digital space. So these include supporting solidarity and inclusion, fostering participation within the digital public space, and increasing safety, security, empowerment of individuals. And this really matters, these digital rights, because we talk a lot about user needs, but we don't really talk a lot about user rights. And as more and more of our services kind of get online, it's very important for us to be able to think about digital rights and how do we afford these to individuals. Supported journeys is one way that we can actually afford them to people. But supported journey is also really important because, as I'll discuss later in this presentation, is because of safeguarding reasons. Now, not all relationships will need to be verified. So those on the kind of informal side of the spectrum, where perhaps you're asking a friend to check if you filled out a form correctly, that doesn't really need to be a verified relationship. But as you get more onto the formal side of support, we need to make sure that that relationship between person A and their supporter can be verified and has actually been established in order for us to be able to give that supporter access to a service, to an account, or to make decisions on somebody else's behalf. This is really important for us to verify that relationship because we need to make sure that we can mitigate as many harms as possible that could be suffered by person A. And these harms can be really wide-ranging. So everything from health and welfare harms to financial affairs, but more so even around identity fraud and theft. And that really includes impersonation or an account takeover. But there's other reasons too. So I'm going to give these to you. So the other reason we need to provide supported journeys is because we need to really reduce the amount of fear and anxiety that people have. Filling out a government form or accessing a government service overwhelms a lot of people. And we've been told through user research a lot of these stories where people have a real fear and anxiety of getting into trouble or getting it wrong. And it's very often this kind of fear and anxiety that's driving someone to actually seek support and reassurance. But then they get into this really nasty cycle because by including somebody else, they then worry that they're doing something wrong or that they're including the wrong person. And so a lot of this kind of breeds a kind of secrecy where unsafe practice can start to really thrive because of all of this fear and anxiety. So the real big insight here is we need to normalize help. We need to normalize getting help, regardless of how that help looks like. And we can start to do this by making sure that we kind of make this journey front and center for people when they land on our service pages. The next reason supported journeys that I kind of wanted to unpack is that actually it can really help us reduce errors. So we've seen a lot in our service that when people are helping someone fill out a form, it is very easy to kind of default when you see the word yours, where the supporter thinks that that word your is related to them as opposed to person A. So very often we get the wrong birthdays or the wrong date of birth, the wrong birthdays or the wrong postcode or address or contact details. And if we are able to actually customize the journey with names, we can help to reduce the cognitive load on the supporter, and that can also help to reduce errors. So it could be really simple things like avoiding language like this, do you have an account? And rather saying something like, does Wendy have an account? It can also really help to reduce delays. And this is the last reason I think supported journeys is really important. This is really especially the case when it comes to formal supporters or formal relationships. Because what we need to do is we need to make sure that we can verify that relationship as soon as we can, that we can then, once that verification has happened, that we can get the person the help that they need or access to the service they need as quickly as possible, so that we make sure that no vulnerable person and their supporter is left in any significant distress. So that is some of the reasons why I think supported journeys matters and why we need to take this more seriously in the work that we're doing. And so I'm now going to kind of share a little bit of the learnings that I have come across while doing this research and doing this work. The very first learning I wanted to share is that support is always established through a relationship. So behind every supported journey is a relationship. And as I've showed you earlier, that spectrum of support, it kind of maps from everything from informal to formal. When I was doing some work in trying to understand what these informal and formal journeys look like beyond just our LPA relationship, I started to kind of discover these kind of categories. The first relationship is an informal request for or an offer of support from someone in a personal network. So this could be a family member, a friend, a neighbor, a colleague. The next feels like something where it's working with a charity, where it's not really a regulated industry. This isn't necessarily someone like a solicitor or someone offering financial services, but it's someone who's able to offer advice and guidance and very often able to provide a form-filling service at a much lower cost than the next kind of supported journey, which is those professional services. So this is your legal sector, which includes solicitors, will writers, estate planners, but also financial advisors, etc. Then there is the kind of next category, which very often features within a clinical setting, and that's around best interest decision making. These clinical settings can also expand to include blue light services. And then lastly, it's the regulatory and legal relationships. And these are really the ones that are probably least understood. These include things like third-party mandates that you can set up with a bank, appointeeships, which is managed by DWP. But then there's also things like guardianships and deputyships and parenthood, and also general and lasting powers of attorney. If we were going to kind of plot these different categories on that same spectrum that I showed you earlier, it would kind of look something like this. But I wanted to bring your attention to a little bit more of that formal end of the spectrum, where those relationships are sort of less understood and less well known. And that's around the professional services, the clinical settings, and the regulatory and legal side of things. These types of formal support really are very often come in the form of authoritative relationships. Now, I'm going to be talking quite a lot about this authoritative relationship space today, and also just to give you all a heads up that there is a GPG guide that is going to be coming out quite soon in the future that will give you much further guidance on how you can establish and verify these relationships between these two people. But essentially, the very first authoritative relationship is the one that the lasting power of attorney service fits into, and that is delegated authority. This is where somebody nominates a representative to do things for them or on their behalf. Then we have asserted authority. This is when a representative is able to declare or assert that they have the authority to act on someone's behalf. An example of this is a mom opening a bank account on behalf of a child. That mother does not need the child's agreement or the consent in order to do so. If that child is a minor, that mother or that parent is also able to, for instance, go to the GP and ask for that minor's, their child's medical record. And then lastly, we've got an appointed authority. And this is when a third party has the legal power to appoint someone to act on behalf of somebody else. So this is the case of, for instance, a court-appointed deputy or a court-appointed company administrator. The kind of design principle that falls out of this first lesson, this first learning, is that we need to be designing for relationships and not just users. Now, there's a kind of second big learning that I've learned around all of this, and that is around access and the fact that it is not binary. So what do I mean by that? So the next step that you need to do, so once you've established this relationship, once you've identified where this relationship lives on the informal, formal support spectrum, and you've potentially maybe identified what kind of, if it is a formal support, what kind of authority relationship that is. In the case of those authority relationships, they need to be verified. Those relationships need to be verified in order to protect and respect the independence and privacy of person A, as well as to offer safeguards against those undue pressure and fraud. So when we're thinking about this kind of support that person A needs, we need to start thinking to ourselves, like, what kind of support do they need and what kind of access does the supporter therefore require? Is the support temporary? Is it contextual or due to circumstance? Or is the support actually permanent in nature? Once we have some answers to those questions, we can then start to think a little bit about what kind of access is needed. And we need to be thinking much more imaginatively about how we think about access. Access isn't just something that is binary. It's not about giving the supporter no access or giving the supporter all access. Care should really be taken to ensure that person A is given as many options as possible to control how much or how little access is given and assigned to that supporter. So when you're thinking about how to actually do this, how do we think about access and mapping these relationships to access needs? What I've started to kind of think through is mapping access need to temporary access, contextual access, or permanent access. So for temporary access, this would be use cases that include things like childhood or fluctuating capacity or potentially imprisonment and probation, displacement, or somebody who is a victim of abuse. Contextual access usually includes things like somebody's limited ability to access a service, or they've got no or limited confidence on how to undertake the task at hand, or there's no to limited sort of skills in order to start or complete something, or there is no to limited knowledge. So these are all sort of more contextual pieces. And then there is permanent access. So these use cases include things like permanent loss of capacity or impaired cognitive ability, disability or learning disorder, and in the case of the probate service, the unfortunate circumstance of death. The last lesson I wanted to share was around consent and the kind of relationship that consent has with time. So time becomes a major stakeholder when you're thinking about consent and supported journeys. So in order to keep risk around harm to an absolute minimum, we have to think about safeguards that kind of exist within the service that we're offering. One potential safeguard is the recording of consent. And so that is especially important when we are ensuring that the supporter is acting on the consent of person A. So now the thing where I was talking about time becoming a stakeholder in all of this is that authority relationships, when it comes to them, consent is usually established and verified through that formal process of making a relationship in the first place. So once that consent has been established, so as an example, when you are making an LPA, there is a particular role in that in our service called a certificate provider that has a conversation with the donor and checks that the donor is not giving and bestowing this power to their attorneys under any undue pressure, and that they are doing so of their own free will. The donor then signs that agreement, giving their consent that they give these decision-making powers to their attorneys. So this means that consent is captured in that moment, in that time. And so when that attorney comes to want to use that LPA in the future, it means that consent has been captured retrospectively. And we, as a service owner, we don't have to keep going back to the donor, back to person A, to keep saying, are you happy that the attorney acts on your behalf? Because that consent has been already captured in the past. But what it does mean is that we need to verify that relationship. And this is kind of one of the reasons I keep coming back to the importance of verifying these important formal relationships with people. Now, this is, of course, like a different case if you are dealing with an informal request for support. In those instances, it is much more likely that we need to capture consent in real time, so that we capture the consent of person A in real time. However, there are special circumstances where consent doesn't have to be established at all, and that is actually in the case of a parent and a child, where that child is a minor. So that child does not need to give their consent to the parent or to the bank for the parent to, for instance, open a bank account in their name, or the child doesn't need to give consent to the GP practice to give their parent access to their medical records. So the kind of lessons that fall out of this is that consent has a temporal quality that is tied to the establishing of the relationship, and this impacts how and when consent is recorded, and then how it is treated at a potentially later date. So I wanted to kind of wind up some of these lessons talking about the design principles, because we work in government and we are basically nothing without design principles. The thing that I've tried to do here is I've tried to map each of these design principles to the service standard. So the first principle is around designing for relationships, not just users, and that really maps to service standard 1 around knowing who your users are and understanding their needs. The second thing is determining the nature of the relationship between person A and their supporter, and where necessary, verifying any of those formal relationships. Again, there will be GPG guidance coming out where that'll help you kind of verify those formal relationships. The next is talking about access need. And so this is mapping that established relationship to the type of access need, and really kind of thinking about, is this temporary access? Is this contextual access? Is this permanent access? And then giving that the necessary design treatments. The fourth one is around ensuring agency by design, and that is by making sure that as much as possible, especially where we have a consenting and a person A that has capacity, that person A has as many controls and transparency as possible about what the supporter is doing on their behalf, and has controls to limit how much they get to see or what they don't get to see. And that leads us to principle 5, which is about removing those barriers to transparency. And then the last one is about upholding consent and making sure that consent becomes part of the safeguards that we offer within our services when we're designing supported journeys. So as a summary, because I realize I've said a lot, I've put together sort of a visual on what we spoke about. So supported journeys are always established through relationships. These relationships can be around an informal request for support, done through a regulatory or legal process, best interest decision making, which is usually within a clinical setting, working with a charity, or working with a professional services across legal or financial. These then need to be mapped to their various access needs once these relationships have been established, and those include thinking about temporary, contextual, or permanent access, and the different kinds of use cases that map to each of those. We then need to make sure that we understand the associated legislation or regulation, looking at the best practice guidance around all of that. And that then starts to help us understand, think about consent and that temporal quality, so how it's asked and when it's asked. And of course, all of this informs the design treatment that we give our services. Before I wrap up, there's 2 last things that I wanted to say. The one thing is that Simon and I, Simon Manby, who is my colleague, he's a senior product manager at Ministry of Justice, and he's working with me on lasting powers of attorney. Simon and I want to host an event on supported journeys and delegated access. We've got the date in mind around Tuesday, the 12th of April at around 3 p.m. We're looking for speakers. So do you have any lessons around supported journeys? Would you like to share those with us? Please do get in touch. If you don't have any lessons that you can share at this point in time, but you do want to attend, I'm going to drop some links in the chat, but you can also email us, and those are our email addresses there. I have also written a blog about supported journeys and the importance and why we should be kind of prioritizing these within our service. I will drop that link in the chat too. And then lastly, I have developed a framework, which is essentially a lot more detailed of what I discussed today. And I will be putting another link in the chat. And that is it. So thank you so much for listening to me. I would love to open it up to questions and comments that anyone has. And yeah, I'll just kind of exit my screen. Thank you. Right, let me get those links in the chat for you. So here we go. And I hope everyone found that interesting. There we go, there are those links. If there are not any questions, I have some questions that I wanted to ask the group.
Actually, sorry, Lisa, I don't see the link. I don't see the chat on the side. So maybe, I don't know for what reason, maybe other people can see that. But if I don't see the chat functionality itself,
Right.
so maybe if you can just have some of those links via an email, maybe, I don't know.
Yes, I am super happy. I'm going to make a note of your name and I will email you.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
You are very, very welcome. Okay. I think there's one question from Alex. You mentioned using people's names instead of yours. Do you know of any data research that supports that? In our own systems, we don't have delegated journeys on accounts, but changing the wording on a supported route might be a quick win. I do not have any data or research on that right now. What we are looking to do in our own work is we definitely will be testing more of this. We definitely are planning to build out a much more robust supported journey for more people and being able to kind of collect that. What I have seen is that very many services use their own terms. So they, for instance, say, what is the applicant's date of birth? And that's the kind of customization that takes place in those supported journeys. So this is especially, so I'm thinking of a service, so Blue Badge do this. They'll say, you know, what is the applicant's name? What is the applicant's date of birth? And that helps kind of replace yours. Sorry, I don't have any data research around that, but I hope that kind of helps just by pulling in some examples from other services. Okay, we don't seem to have any questions. So I wanted to ask a question to the group, if that's okay. So the one thing I wanted to ask is regarding supported journeys, do you think that there is anything in addition you would need to kind of prioritize this work within your service? Oh, I've just got somebody who's like nudged me. There is a question above. Okay, thank you, Manny. This is awesome and really exciting. How do you see this impacting the private sector? Any particular industries this could help? Well, so I really think we need to get onto the private sector with this. I think there is definitely a way for us to be able to hopefully educate the private sector in showing them what best practice looks like, and government can really take the lead on this and to be able to provide a lot of the best practice, the best learnings, and to be able to kind of encourage them to follow our patterns. So one of the things that we've really struggled with lasting powers of attorney, and what users tell us, is that there is really kind of poor awareness of what LPAs are in lots of organizations, and there isn't a wide kind of understanding about these delegated access or delegated authority relationships. And so when it comes to the private sector, our users often tell us they have to go through several different really painful phone calls and pass from one person to the next. So I do think that it is impacting the private sector in the way that it's costing the private sector lots of time, lots of money, lots of inefficiencies to be able to establish these relationships and knowing how to verify them. And if we could kind of raise the importance and the priority of supported journeys, that would really help to improve like the way that they are able to verify those relationships much more quickly, and then to be able to give people the access to the service that they need. Does that help to answer your question? Great. Kirsty has asked a question. Has also just, she's left a comment, also in unplanned hospital, social care homes. Kirsty, do you mind kind of expanding on that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Hello, I can come
Hi, thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all those.
Thank you.
No, just as you were sort of running through, it was almost when you were showing all the different examples along the spectrum that you had, and the sort of the different ways in which that was involved. Some of the project work that I'm involved in at the moment is around unplanned care, and especially around that last question around how do we involve private sector within this. It's almost kind of, what are some of those moments where both public and private sector are sort of interwoven?
Right, yeah.
How does that prove a sort of interesting and incredibly complex consent and data sharing moment for people involved, and people who are going through a moment of crisis, a moment that they haven't planned for, something that's really quick and something which needs to work through itself relatively quickly in order to provide best care for someone.
Yeah, and I think this is part of what's really interesting with supported journeys, is that once you give it the attention it needs, all of these different sort of design challenges start to emerge, and all of the kind of nuance and detail around it starts to emerge. And like example that you've just given there now, there is no easy answer to something like that, but we really do need to be able to raise some of these more what we think of as really niche use cases that can cause like a huge amount of concern and distress for somebody if there's no support for that person, right? Because we just didn't think that it was going to come up often enough.
Mm-hmm. Totally, yeah. And I see those sort of like repeat patterns of something happens, someone isn't ready for it, information needs to be shared, people need to be updated, people need help to do the right thing, and all those principles that sit behind that could be repeated in other places, can't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Simon, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. It was just a quick one that I've seen. So everybody in government I think is starting to see this as a really important thing. But it's yes, we know this is really important. It's 5 years on our backlog. We'll definitely get to it. And it's a bit like business identity in that everyone knows it's a massive thing that's coming up. And I think the nuance of it and the stuff that you've outlined, where it's almost going to have to be a bespoke thing for each service that people are doing. How do we get this to a point where it's surfaced and more recognised in government as a need? I think is the kind of the nebulous question around it.
I think doing more events like this, talking about it more, I think much more like lessons in sharing and learning. I think when I started doing this work, I didn't realize that there were other supported journeys that were being designed across different services, and I stumbled across them purely because I was fascinated by this work and I saw a huge need for it. And we need, in the same way that we've got a design, different communities for design ethics or identity, we almost need a design community that's, supporting one another around supported journeys. I think because of the kind of treatment where, like you say, each service is going to have to like really think about, how this sort of manifests within their own service. There will be some of those common patterns and principles that occur, like Kirsty was mentioning, that you can start to apply in different across different services, but we haven't discovered what they are yet. And because the work just hasn't quite been done, there will be lots of uniqueness that will be there for each service. But I am almost sure that once we start doing more of the work, we will start to see some patterns and some principles that we can kind of stretch across, and apply to all different services. But for me, a lot of it is around awareness and then education and then continuous kind of support and engagement for those people who are working on it. We've only got 2 minutes left. I would love to ask just sort of open questions to the group, you know, where to from here, really? What more do you feel you need to kind of elevate the importance of this work on your own service? And really, how can I help, I guess?
So I'll jump into the deafening silence just to say,
yes, thank you, Annie.
Because I can't bear them, so I'd rather say something than nothing. You know, that's how my brain works. But to say the reason that I haven't got, I'm just like not at that point yet. I imagine there's a lot of people on this call whose brains are whirring away, just going, that is so interesting. We really have to think about that. We really have to bring that to, you know, I'll be talking our team through what you've discussed. So I think that the next steps will come. But I think at the moment we're all going, yeah, what is the next steps? This is so interesting. This is so important. We have to work it out. We have to make sure that there's much more supported journeys. And talk about how we do that. So
amazing.
The silent majority going, I don't know yet, but it's so important.
That is great.
Really also, I'm literally texting my mother about power of attorney and like various things in our family. It's been really useful, so thank you.
Oh, great. I'm really, really so pleased. And with that sort of really positive comment, thank you, Annie. We are going to close the session. Thank you so much to everyone who joined. I really, really appreciate you being here today. I hope you found this helpful. I hope you found this useful. Please reach out to me should you wish to talk about this in more detail, or if you need anything expanded or explained in a different way. I'm super happy to help, and I care about this topic hugely. Obsessed, just a bit. Thank you. That's it. Amazing. Take care, everyone. Hope you have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.